February 20th, 1942, 550 miles northeast of Rabaul, Solomon Sea. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare couldn't believe what he was seeing through the gun sight of his F-4F Wildcat. The massive Japanese bomber, trailing smoke from its right engine, showed no signs of stopping. He'd already hit it with what should have been a killing burst, watched his tracers tear through the fuselage, seen pieces of metal spinning away into the Pacific wind. Yet the damn thing kept coming, boring straight for the USS Lexington with suicidal determination. O'Hare squeezed the trigger again. His 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns roared, pumping another concentrated burst into the bomber's vitals. This time, something catastrophic happened. The right engine didn't just smoke, it exploded. Flames erupted along the wing, spreading with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the entire aircraft became a flying torch, a cigar-shaped inferno tumbling toward the ocean. "Jesus Christ," O'Hare muttered into his radio, watching the Japanese bomber disintegrate in a fireball that seemed out of proportion to the damage inflicted. They burned like gasoline-soaked rags. Below him, 14 more Japanese bombers were dying the same death. F-4F Wildcats from Lexington's fighter squadron were shredding them with almost contemptuous ease. Not through superior marksmanship or overwhelming firepower, but because the Japanese aircraft seemed purpose-built to incinerate. A few good hits, and they became flying crematoriums, taking their 7-man crews to deaths too horrible to imagine. Of the 17 bombers that attacked Lexington's task force that morning, 15 never made it home. The slaughter was so one-sided that American pilots returned to their carriers shaking their heads in disbelief. What kind of aircraft burned so easily? What kind of design philosophy accepted such catastrophic vulnerability? What none of them knew, what nobody in the Allied forces suspected in early 1942, was that they were witnessing the consequences of one of the most fateful engineering decisions in aviation history. A decision made in a Mitsubishi design office 4 years earlier that would doom thousands of Japanese airmen to fiery deaths. A decision so shocking that when American engineers finally captured an intact example and examined it, they initially refused to believe their own findings. This is the story of the Mitsubishi G4M, the aircraft the Allies codenamed Betty. The Japanese called it Hamaki, cigar, for its rotund fuselage and its tendency to light up like one when hit. This is the story of how American technical intelligence discovered that Japan's most important bomber was essentially a flying fuel tank wrapped in aluminum, and how that discovery revealed a military philosophy so alien to Western thinking that it bordered on incomprehensible. The journey to understanding would require captured aircraft, razor-sharp analysis, and the dawning horror that the enemy wasn't just accepting risk, they were designing death traps and sending men to die in them as a matter of policy. September 1937. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nagoya, Japan. Kiro Hanjo stared at the specifications the Imperial Japanese Navy had just handed him and felt his stomach tighten. As chief designer for Mitsubishi's bomber program, he'd faced challenging requirements before. This was different. This was impossible. The Navy wanted a twin-engine, land-based bomber that could fly 2,300 miles while carrying a 1,768-pound torpedo. Cruising speed needed to be 247 miles per hour, maximum speed approaching 270, ceiling above 30,000 feet. And this was the killer requirement. It had to achieve this with only 2 engines, because 4 engine designs were deemed too complex for mass production. Hanjo pulled out his slide rule and started calculating. The math was brutal. To achieve that range with existing engine technology, the aircraft would need to carry roughly 1,260 gallons of fuel. That fuel would weigh approximately 8,400 pounds. Add the 1,768-pound torpedo, the 7-man crew, defensive armament, and the aircraft structure itself, and you were looking at a gross weight approaching 30,000 pounds. The problem was obvious. With that much weight, something had to give. The Navy specifications didn't mention armor protection or self-sealing tanks, but Hanjo knew American bombers were incorporating both. Self-sealing tanks used a rubber compound that swelled when exposed to fuel, automatically plugging bullet holes. The technology added about 35% to fuel tank weight and reduced capacity accordingly. Hanjo did the math again. If he included self-sealing tanks and armor, the range dropped to roughly 1,400 miles, 1,000 miles short of requirements. The aircraft would be useless for the Navy's planned strategy of long-range strikes across the vast Pacific. He could meet the range requirement only by eliminating every ounce of unnecessary weight. The decision he made that September afternoon would kill thousands of Japanese airmen, but from Hanjo's perspective, shaped by Japanese military doctrine and Imperial Japan's strategic situation, it wasn't really a decision at all. It was inevitable. Japanese naval aviation doctrine in 1937 was built on the concept of decisive battle. Drawing from Admiral Togo's victory over Russia in 1905, Japanese strategists envisioned a climactic fleet engagement that would determine control of the Pacific in a single day. Land-based bombers would be the spearhead, long-range aircraft that could strike enemy fleets hundreds of miles from their bases, crippling them before surface ships ever engaged. This strategy required extreme range, more range than any existing bomber could achieve. The Navy specifications weren't arbitrary, they reflected cold strategic calculus. Either Japanese bombers could reach American ships operating from Pearl Harbor, Guam, and the Philippines, where the entire strategy collapsed. Moreover, Japanese military culture accepted casualties in ways that shocked Western observers. The concept of gyokusai, honorable death rather than surrender, permeated military thinking. Pilots were expected to press home attacks regardless of cost. If 20% of a bomber force died completing a successful mission, that wasn't a tragedy. It was an acceptable exchange. If 50% died, it was still worth it if the mission succeeded. This wasn't callousness. It reflected a fundamental difference in how Japanese and American militaries valued individual lives versus strategic objectives. American doctrine prioritized bringing aircrews home. Japanese doctrine prioritized mission success, full stop. Hanjo understood this calculus. The Navy wasn't asking him to design the safest bomber. They were asking for the most capable bomber, and capability meant range above all else. Armor and self-sealing tanks were luxuries Japan couldn't afford if they wanted the weapon their strategy required. He picked up his pencil and started sketching. The G4M would have no armor plate protecting the crew. The fuel tanks would be simple aluminum structures integrated directly into the wing, the lightest possible solution. Defensive armament would be minimal. Every gram saved was a gram that could become fuel or payload.
The prototype that emerged from this philosophy was, by Japanese standards, magnificent. It first flew on October 23, 1939, and exceeded virtually every specification. Top speed hit 266 miles per hour. Maximum range reached 2,935 miles, further than any operational bomber in the world. With a reduced fuel load, it could carry a 1,764-pound torpedo 2,300 miles, exactly as specified. The aircraft's appearance was distinctive. Its fuselage was almost perfectly cylindrical, hence the cigar nickname, creating maximum internal volume with minimum surface area and drag. The wings were gracefully tapered, housing fuel tanks that held an astonishing 1,260 gallons. Two Mitsubishi Kasei 14-cylinder radial engines, each producing 1,530 horsepower, provided power. But walking around the prototype, anyone familiar with American or British bombers would have noticed troubling absences. No armored plate behind the pilot's seats, no armored bulkheads protecting the crew compartment. The fuel tanks, visible through access panels, were bare aluminum without any protective lining. The crew positions had no armored glass. The defensive guns, 4 7.7mm machine guns and a single 20mm cannon, looked inadequate for a bomber this size. American engineers designing a similar aircraft would have flagged these omissions immediately. Japanese engineers saw them as features, not bugs. The lack of protection saved approximately 1,200 pounds, which translated to roughly 170 additional miles of range or 1,200 additional pounds of bombs. The first production G4M1 rolled off Mitsubishi's assembly line in April 1941. By December, 120 were operational, deployed to Formosa and French Indochina. Their crews, elite naval aviation units, trained intensively in long-range navigation, night flying, and torpedo attacks. They believed they were flying the finest bomber in the world. And by Japanese metrics, range, speed, and payload, they were correct. What they didn't know was that they were manning flying death traps.
December 8th, 1941. Clark Field, Philippines. The first G4M combat mission should have been a disaster. Due to morning fog over Formosan airfields, the raid didn't launch until hours behind schedule. American forces had been on alert since Pearl Harbor was attacked hours earlier. They knew Japanese bombers were coming. Yet when 27 G4Ms from the 1st Kokutai appeared over Clark Field in mid-afternoon, they found American B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters parked neatly on the runways, like gifts. The result was catastrophic for American forces. The G4Ms bombed from 22,000 feet with devastating accuracy. Half of MacArthur's bomber force was destroyed on the ground. The P-40s that managed to take off found themselves hopelessly outrun by the Japanese bombers, which cruised away at speeds the American fighters couldn't match at altitude. 2 days later came the G4M's greatest triumph. On December 10th, 27 Bettys armed with torpedoes attacked the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse off the Malayan coast. Flying from Saigon, a distance of 400 miles, far beyond the range of any other bomber, they executed textbook torpedo attacks at wave-top height. The first torpedoes struck Prince of Wales at 11:44 hours. More followed. Within 3 hours, both capital ships were on the bottom, taking 840 sailors with them. It was the first time in history that capital ships maneuvering in open water had been sunk by air power alone. Churchill later called it one of the most direct shocks of the entire war. The Japanese were euphoric. The G4M had validated their entire strategic concept. Long-range bombers operating from land bases could dominate vast ocean areas, neutralizing enemy fleets without risking valuable carriers.
The aircraft's extreme range allowed it to strike targets other bombers couldn't reach. Its speed and altitude capability made it difficult to intercept. For 6 glorious months, the G4M seemed invincible. Formations ranged across the Pacific, bombing Port Moresby, Darwin, and Rabaul with impunity. Against poorly equipped Allied fighters and scattered defensive forces, the Betty's vulnerabilities didn't matter. Speed and range counted for everything, and the G4M had both. But warning signs appeared for those who looked carefully. Combat reports mentioned the damaged G4Ms had a disturbing tendency to catch fire when hit. Some pilots noticed that aircraft didn't just burn, they exploded, consumed in seconds by flames that seemed impossibly intense. A few astute observers wondered why severely damaged B-17s could limp home, while similarly damaged G4Ms invariably became fireballs. The Japanese High Command dismissed these concerns. Casualties were acceptable. The aircraft was achieving its mission. That was what mattered. Then came February 20th, 1942, and the Lexington disaster.
The attack on USS Lexington's task force was textbook Japanese tactics. 17 G4Ms from the 4th Air Group launched from Rabaul, flying 550 miles to intercept the American carrier group threatening their newly captured base. Without fighter escort, the A6M-0s lacked the range even with external tanks. The bombers pressed on alone, confident in their speed and altitude. They were detected 76 miles out by Lexington's radar. The carrier launched every available Wildcat, 16 F-4F-3s, the Navy's frontline fighter. The Wildcats were significantly slower than the G4Ms, with a top speed of only 318 miles per hour versus the Beatty's 266. But they had two crucial advantages. They operated from a mobile base directly in the bomber's path, and they carried 6 .5 caliber machine guns with nearly 1,500 rounds. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, leading the fighter squadron, positioned his Wildcats to intercept at 18,000 feet. As the G4M formation approached in their standard V formation, Thatch couldn't help but admire their discipline. They maintained perfect spacing, their gunners already traversing their weapons, searching for attackers. All units, this is Thatch. Box them. High, low, beam attacks. Go for the engines. Don't follow them through. Break away and reset. The first Wildcat pass scattered the formation. Tracers converged on the lead bomber from 3 directions. Thatch saw his rounds punching through the G4M's fuselage, bits of aluminum spinning away. He expected the bomber to shrug off the hits, like American bombers did, absorbing punishment while maintaining formation. Instead, the Beatty exploded. Not caught fire, exploded. One moment, it was a functioning aircraft. The next, it was an expanding fireball tumbling toward the ocean, pieces separating in every direction. The transformation took perhaps 2 seconds. Jesus, Thatch breathed. They have no tanks at all. It's just fuel sloshing around in the wings. He was more right than he knew. 15 minutes later, it was over. 15 G4Ms were burning wreckage scattered across 50 miles of ocean. Only 2 bombers limped back to Rabaul, both so badly shot up they were written off upon landing. Not a single bomb had struck an American ship. The Japanese lost 119 trained aircrew in exchange for 0 American casualties.
The returning pilots told a story that chilled their commanders.
The American fighters weren't particularly skilled. They weren't even particularly aggressive. They'd simply shot at the bombers, and the bombers had burst into flames like paper lanterns. One pilot reported firing a single long burst into a G4M and watching the entire wing erupt in fire seconds later. "It's like they're made of gasoline," he reported. "One good hit in the wing and they just explode." Japanese Naval Aviation Command called an emergency conference. Something was clearly wrong. But what? The G4M's specifications hadn't changed. The American fighters were using the same .50 caliber weapons they'd always used. Why the sudden catastrophic losses? The answer, though nobody realized it yet, lay in the fundamental difference between a training environment and a combat environment. In training, Japanese bombers rarely took hits. When they did, it was from small caliber practice ammunition. The true vulnerability of the integral fuel tank design had never been tested. Now it was being tested daily, and it was failing spectacularly. November 7th, 1942. Eagle Farm Air Base, Brisbane, Australia. Captain Frank McCoy of the U.S. Air Forces stood in Hangar 7, staring at the most complete captured Japanese bomber the Allies had yet secured. It had been discovered partially intact at Buna Airfield in Papua New Guinea, salvaged by Australian forces and transported to Brisbane for evaluation by the newly formed Technical Air Intelligence Unit. The G4M looked massive up close. Its cigar-shaped fuselage stretched nearly 66 feet, larger than he'd expected. The twin Mitsubishi radial engines had diameter nearly 4 feet across. Despite combat damage to the tail and fuselage, the aircraft was remarkably complete. Complete enough for the detailed technical analysis McCoy's team had been tasked with conducting. "All right," McCoy announced to the assembled team of engineers, intelligence officers, and combat pilots, "let's see what makes these things tick. Start with external inspection, then we'll open her up." The external examination revealed immediately that something was odd. The aircraft had minimal armor, a few thin plates around the tail gunner's position, nothing protecting the pilot's or crew compartment. The fuel filler caps dotted across the wings suggested fuel tanks integrated directly into the wing structure, not unusual, but worth noting. The defensive armament looked laughable by American standards. 4 rifle-caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon. A comparable American bomber, like the B-25 Mitchell, carried 10 .50 caliber machine guns. The Betty's guns looked like they'd been borrowed from a fighter. "Defensive armament is inadequate," McCoy noted, "but we knew that from combat reports. Let's look at the fuel system." This was where things got interesting and disturbing. Opening the access panels along the wings revealed the fuel tank arrangement. What the engineers found made them exchange glances of disbelief. The wings weren't just housing fuel tanks. The wings were the fuel tanks. The entire internal structure of each wing between the front and rear spars had been sealed and converted into a massive fuel bladder. There were no separate tank structures. The fuel literally sloshed around inside the wing's structural framework, contained only by the wing's aluminum skin and sealed joints.
"This is insane," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Page, the senior engineer on the team. "The entire wing is full of fuel. One tracer anywhere in here and the whole damn thing goes up." But it got worse, much worse. Examining the fuel tank construction revealed there was no self-sealing capability, None. Zero. The tank surfaces were bare aluminum. When a bullet punctured the skin, fuel simply poured out, or more accurately, vaporized into an explosive mist. There was no rubber lining to swell and plug holes, no fire-resistant foam or baffle system, nothing. American self-sealing tanks used multiple layers, an outer rubber layer, a middle layer of rubber-impregnated fabric, and an inner layer that would swell when exposed to gasoline, plugging bullet holes within seconds. The system added about 35% to tank weight, but made aircraft vastly more survivable. A self-sealing tank could take multiple hits and keep functioning. The G4M's tanks would leak catastrophically from a single hit. And with fuel vaporizing inside a sealed wing structure, any spark would trigger an explosion. "Let me make sure I understand this," McCoy said slowly. "They built a bomber where the entire wing is a fuel tank holding how much?" Page checked his measurements. "Approximately 1,260 gallons total. Call it 8,400 pounds of aviation gasoline distributed throughout both wings. And there's nothing preventing that fuel from igniting if the wing is hit?" "Nothing. Actually, it's worse than that." Page pointed to the wing's internal structure. "See these ribs and spars? All these joints and seams? When the aircraft maneuvers, the wing flexes. That creates vapor gaps at every joint. You hit this wing with an incendiary round, and you're not just puncturing a tank, you're creating an ideal fuel-air mixture. It'll detonate." The room went silent as the implications sank in. "They knew," someone finally said. "They had to know this would happen."
Of course they knew, McCoy replied. This isn't an oversight. Look at the rest of the aircraft. It's beautifully engineered. The engine installation is superb. The aerodynamics are excellent. This is the product of highly competent designers. They made this choice deliberately. The question was why? Why would brilliant engineers design a death trap? The answer lay in the performance specifications. McCoy's team weighed and measured every component they could access. They calculated structural weights, fuel loads, payload capacity. The numbers told a clear story. The G4M weighed about 14,000 pounds empty. Maximum takeoff weight was 27,500 pounds. That meant it could carry 13,500 pounds of fuel, crew, payload, and ammunition. Of that, fuel accounted for 8,400 pounds, the crew about 1,200 pounds, ammunition 800 pounds, leaving roughly 3,000 pounds for bombs or torpedoes. If they'd included self-sealing tanks, they would have added approximately 700 pounds and reduced fuel capacity by about 300 pounds. If they'd included armor for the 7 crew positions, that was another 600 to 800 pounds. Call it 1,500 pounds total for protection. That 1,500 pounds was the difference between a 2,300-mile range and a 1,700-mile range. It was the difference between reaching Pearl Harbor from Wake Island and coming up 600 miles short. It was the difference between a strategically useful bomber and an expensive paperweight. They traded their lives for miles, Page said quietly. Every pound of armor was 10 miles less range. Every gallon of self-sealing capacity was 15 miles they couldn't fly. And the range was the whole point, McCoy finished. Without the range, the aircraft is useless for their strategy. With the range, it's deadly to enemy ships and to its own crew. The team continued their analysis over the following days. Every finding confirmed the initial assessment. The Betty was optimized for exactly one thing: delivering torpedoes or bombs to targets 1,000 plus miles from base. Everything else, crew survival,
Damage tolerance, defensive capability had been sacrificed on that altar. The structural analysis revealed the airframe was actually quite robust. The wing spars could handle extraordinary loads. The fuselage construction was sound. If the fuel tanks had been properly protected, the aircraft would have been reasonably survivable. But they weren't, and that made all the difference.
McCoy compiled his findings into a classified report that circulated through Allied intelligence in early 1943. The document was extraordinary, not just for its technical detail, but for what it revealed about Japanese military thinking. The report's key findings: fuel system, integral wing tanks with no self-sealing capability, total capacity 1,260 gallons distributed throughout both wings, extreme fire risk from any penetrating hit, estimated survival rate from wing hits less than 10%, armor protection minimal, no pilot armor, no crew compartment armor, fin plates at tail gunner position only, crew completely vulnerable to forward and beam attacks. Defensive armament inadequate. 4 7.7mm machine guns comparable to .30 caliber provide insufficient defensive fire. Single 20mm tail cannon effective but has limited traverse. Performance exceptional range, 2,935 miles maximum achieved entirely through weight savings. Speed competitive, 266 miles per hour, but not sufficient to outrun modern fighters. Ceiling adequate, 30,000 plus feet. Conclusion: aircraft represents conscious design trade-off, prioritizing range over survivability. Designers understood and accepted vulnerability as necessary cost of achieving strategic performance requirements. Crew survival clearly subordinated to mission capability. Tactical recommendation: target wings first. Any hits to wing structure likely to cause catastrophic fuel fire. Do not waste ammunition on fuselage. Focus fire on wing roots and engine nacelles where fuel is most concentrated. This last recommendation changed Allied fighter tactics immediately. Pilots were instructed to aim for the wings, not the fuselage. The results were dramatic. Betty kill rates increased 40% within weeks as American pilots learned to trigger the fuel explosions deliberately. But McCoy's report raised disturbing questions beyond tactics. The most troubling was philosophical. How could highly trained engineers design aircraft they knew would kill their own crews? McCoy included a speculative section in his report addressing this. Japanese design philosophy appears fundamentally different from Western approaches, where American designers prioritize bringing crews home alive. Japanese designers prioritize mission effectiveness above crew survival. This is not callousness, but reflects different cultural and strategic contexts. Japan's limited industrial capacity means they cannot match American production. Their strategy requires maximum effectiveness from each sortie. An aircraft that completes its mission with 50% crew casualties is preferable to one that brings everyone home but accomplishes nothing. Moreover, Japanese military culture appears to accept, even embrace fatal risk as honorable. American flyers plan to survive their tours. Japanese flyers appear to plan to die gloriously. Design reflects these different expectations. This analysis, while accurate, shocked American commanders. The idea of deliberately designing death traps was incomprehensible to Western militaries. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The G4M wasn't poorly designed. It was designed for crews who accepted death as part of the mission profile. The intelligence about Betty vulnerability spread rapidly through Allied air forces in the Pacific. Fighter pilots approached G4M encounters with new confidence. The bombers that had seemed formidable in 1941 became known as one-shot lighters by mid-1943. Combat reports from this period tell a consistent story. A few good hits to the wings, and the Betty became a fireball. Pilots described seeing tracer rounds disappear into the wing, followed seconds later by flames erupting from multiple panel lines as vaporized fuel found ignition sources throughout the structure. Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrachul, flying an F-6F Hellcat from USS Lexington, the second carrier to bear that name, described a typical encounter near Truk in February 1944. We caught a formation of 19 Bettys inbound at 18,000 feet. No fighter escort, they were depending on speed and formation defensive fire. I positioned above and behind, came down in a high side run on the trailing aircraft, fired a 3-second burst into the right wing root. The wing lit up like a Christmas tree. Flames erupted from the engine, spread across the entire wing in maybe 5 seconds. The wing failed, and the Betty went into a flat spin, burning the whole way down. I moved to the next one, repeated the procedure. Same result, wing fire, structural failure, spiral into the ocean. I got 6 that day, before my ammunition ran out. 6 bombers in 14 minutes. Every single one burned. That's not marksmanship, that's design failure. Those aircraft were flying bombs waiting for someone to light the fuse. By mid-1944, G4M losses were catastrophic. On any given mission, crews could expect 30 to 50% casualties. Some raids lost 70 to 80% of their aircraft. The Japanese persisted because they had no alternative. No replacement bomber existed that could match the Betty's range, and range was non-negotiable given the vast Pacific distances. Japanese engineers tried to fix the problem. The G4M2 variant, introduced in mid-1943, added rubber strips to the wing's bottom surface, a crude, partial attempt at fuel protection. It reduced speed by 6 miles per hour and range by 196 miles, while providing minimal improvement in survivability. The G4M3, which didn't enter production until October 1944, finally included proper self-sealing tanks. But incorporating the heavier tanks required redesigning the wings and reducing fuel capacity by nearly 1/3. Range dropped to 2,000 miles, barely adequate. Only about 60 were built before war's end. Too little, too late. Most Betty crews flew the vulnerable G4M1 and G4M2 variants until the war ended. They knew they were flying death traps. They climbed aboard anyway because orders were orders and duty was duty. April 18th, 1943. 07:34 hours, 4,500 feet above Bougainville. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of Japan's combined fleet, sat in the forward cabin of a G4M1 Betty bomber, reviewing documents for his inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto had chosen the Betty because it was the only aircraft with sufficient range for the day's itinerary. Fly from Rabaul to Balalel, inspect the airfield, then continue to Shortland before returning. Round-trip distance,
over 1,000 miles. Only the G4M could do it. His aide had expressed concerns about the Betty's vulnerability. Yamamoto waved them off. The route was supposedly secure. They'd have zero fighter escort. What could happen? He never heard the P-38 Lightnings coming. 18 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron, flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, had intercepted based on decoded Japanese communications. They'd flown 435 miles at wave-top height to avoid detection, timing their arrival perfectly. The two Bettys carrying Yamamoto and his staff had no warning. The 6 escorting Zeros were caught out of position, unable to intercept before the P-38s reached the bombers. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, flying the killer element, closed to 200 yards and opened fire. Their combined 16.5 caliber machine guns poured 100 rounds per second into Yamamoto's Betty. The right wing exploded first. Fuel vapor ignited by incendiary rounds created a fireball that consumed the wing in seconds. The wing failed structurally, folding upward at an impossible angle. The bomber snap-rolled left and plunged into the jungle, disintegrating on impact. Yamamoto's body was found the next day, still strapped in his seat, thrown clear on impact. Cause of death? 2 bullet wounds, 1 to the jaw, 1 to the shoulder. Medical examination determined he died before the crash, likely killed in the initial burst of fire before the fuel tanks exploded. His death in a Betty was grimly appropriate. The aircraft that embodied Japan's strategic priorities, extreme range at any cost, had carried their greatest admiral to a fiery end. The design philosophy that sacrificed crew survival for mission capability had claimed its most famous victim.
The Americans who examined wrecked Bettys throughout 1943 and 1944 universally expressed shock at the lack of protection. Technical intelligence officers trained to analyze enemy equipment objectively repeatedly noted their disbelief in official reports. One report from November 1943, analyzing a Betty shot down near Rabaul, included this remarkable passage. Examination of fuel tank construction confirms previous findings, but no longer shocks our engineers. We have accepted that Japanese designers deliberately chose this configuration despite knowing the consequences. What continues to disturb us is the complete absence of any protection for the crew. There is no armor behind the pilot's seat, none protecting the radio operator, navigator, or bombardier. The waist gunners sit fully exposed to beam attacks. Only the tail gunner has minimal armor plates. Conversations with captured aircrew reveal they were aware of the vulnerability. One pilot stated, "We knew if we were hit, we would burn. It was understood." When asked why he continued flying such aircraft, he looked confused by the question. "Because those were my orders," he replied. American airmen would refuse to fly an aircraft this dangerous. The concept of accepting certain death as a condition of employment is alien to our military culture. Yet Japanese crews fly these bombers day after day, knowing each mission may be their last, accepting this as normal. The Betty bomber represents not just an engineering failure, but a window into a military mindset we struggled to comprehend. That incomprehension cut both ways. Japanese engineers, when questioned after the war, were equally baffled by American priorities. Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero fighter, which used similar fuel tank philosophy, later wrote,
American engineers had the luxury of building aircraft with every possible protection because America had unlimited resources. We did not have that luxury. We had to choose: build aircraft that could reach their targets but offered no protection, or build well-protected aircraft that couldn't reach their targets and were therefore useless. We chose effectiveness over safety because effectiveness was what Japan needed. A pilot who dies completing a successful mission serves his country. A pilot who survives but accomplishes nothing serves only himself. Americans designed for the comfort of the individual. We designed for the survival of the nation. These are different philosophies, neither inherently superior, but only one was available to Japan given our circumstances. This defense, while logical within its own framework, masked a crucial fact. The G4M's vulnerability was so extreme it actually reduced effectiveness. An aircraft that burned upon taking any hits couldn't complete its mission if shot down short of the target. The Betty's losses were so catastrophic that increasingly raids failed to put enough aircraft over the target to be effective. By late 1944, the G4M's combat effectiveness had dropped to near zero. Raids that once included 20 to 30 bombers were down to 5 to 10 aircraft simply because no more were available or crewed. Fighter escorts that once numbered dozens now consisted of 2 or 3 Zeros, themselves suffering from fuel shortages and pilot attrition.
August 19th, 1945. Ishima Airfield, Okinawa. 2 G4M bombers, painted pure white with green crosses, circle the airfield. These were Baton 1 and Baton 2, carrying the Japanese surrender delegation to meet with American representatives and arrange the formal end of hostilities. As the Bettys touched down, escorted by 12 P-38 Lightnings and 6 B-25 Mitchells, American personnel crowded around to observe. Many were seeing intact Bettys for the first time. The white paint and peaceful mission created an surreal atmosphere. General Douglas MacArthur had specifically requested Betty bombers for this mission. They were the only Japanese aircraft with the range to fly from Japan to Ishima and return. Even in surrender, the Betty's defining characteristic, extreme range, remained relevant. Technical personnel who examined the surrender aircraft found them to be late production G4M2 variants with the minimal rubber protection under the wings. Still no armor, still vulnerable, still death traps. "These are what they sent their admirals in?" asked a young Army Air Forces lieutenant, inspecting the stripped-down interior. "Range," replied a technical intelligence sergeant who'd been studying Japanese aircraft for 3 years. "It's always about range. They needed every mile they could get. Protection was a luxury they couldn't afford." "Jesus, I wouldn't fly across town in something like this." "You're not Japanese. Different priorities, different philosophy." After the surrender delegation departed, both Bettys were destroyed, ordered burned by MacArthur to prevent any symbolic use by Japanese militarists. The aircraft that traveled to surrender Japan were consumed by the same flames that had killed thousands of their sister ships. It was a fitting end for the design that embodied Japan's fatal strategic choices. The final accounting of the G4M Betty bomber. Production: 2,435 aircraft built between 1941 and 1945. Crews lost: approximately 15,000 plus airmen killed. Combat losses: over 1,800 aircraft lost in combat operations. Primary cause of loss: fuel fire following wing hits.
estimated 85% of losses. Loss rate, 30 to 50% average per mission by 1944. Some missions, 70 to 80%. Survival rate after wing hit, less than 10%. By comparison, the American B-25 Mitchell, a roughly comparable twin-engine bomber, had a combat loss rate of 5 to 8% per mission and a survival rate after damage exceeding 60%. The difference wasn't primarily in crew skill or enemy effectiveness. It was design philosophy converted into casualty statistics. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined Japanese aircraft losses in detail. The section on the G4M made for grim reading. The Mitsubishi G4M bomber exhibited the highest loss rate of any major Japanese aircraft type. Contributing factors included inadequate defensive armament, insufficient speed to evade interception, and, most critically, catastrophic vulnerability to fuel fire. Examination of wreckage and combat film reveals that approximately 85% of G4M losses involved fire. Of these, 90% originated in the wing fuel tanks following penetration by gunfire. Average time from initial hit to catastrophic fire, 8 to 12 seconds. Average time from fire start to structural failure, 15 to 20 seconds. In practical terms, a G4M struck in the wing had approximately 30 seconds of flight time remaining, insufficient time for crew bailout, insufficient time for crash landing. Most crews died in the aircraft. Japanese aircrew were aware of these statistics. Post-war interviews reveal they nicknamed the G4M Hamaki for cigar and Flying Lighter for obvious reasons. Despite this knowledge, morale among Betty crews remained relatively high until late 1944, sustained by concepts of duty and honor that Western observers struggle to comprehend. The G4M represents a case study in design philosophy determining survival rates. An aircraft optimized purely for mission capability, with crew survival as a secondary consideration, proved ultimately counterproductive. High loss rates reduced operational effectiveness more than the aircraft's superior range improved it. Had the G4M been designed with adequate fuel protection and armor, accepting a 20% reduction in range, overall effectiveness would likely have increased due to dramatically reduced loss rates. The Japanese military's failure to recognize this represents a fundamental miscalculation that cost thousands of lives and reduced strategic capability. The report didn't mention that American designers, given the same specifications as Kuro Hanjo faced in 1937, would have refused them. They would have told the Navy that physics didn't allow a bomber with that range and acceptable protection. They would have demanded revised specifications. Japanese designers didn't refuse. Cultural context made refusal impossible. The Navy had determined the range requirement based on strategic necessity. Designers were expected to meet requirements, not question them. The only variable they controlled was what to sacrifice. They sacrificed their airmen.
The captured Betty at Eagle Farm Air Base in Brisbane remained in Allied hands until 1947. It was studied extensively, used for training, and finally scrapped when storage space was needed. No complete G4M1 survives today. All were destroyed during or immediately after the war. A single G4M2 survives at the Plains of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California. It's displayed in its original configuration, bare aluminum with no protective paint. Visitors can see the fuel filler caps marching across the wings, 13 on the left wing, 13 on the right, each one feeding into the vast integral fuel tank that made the Betty simultaneously capable and catastrophic. The museum's placard is remarkably honest. The G-4M Betty bomber was Japan's most important land-based bomber of World War II. Its extreme range, nearly 3,000 miles, allowed it to strike targets no other bomber could reach. This capability came at an extraordinary cost. The Betty's integral fuel tanks, holding 1,260 gallons of aviation gasoline throughout both wings, had no self-sealing protection. Any penetrating hit would likely cause fuel leakage and fire. The aircraft had minimal armor protection for the 7-man crew. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned the Betty would burn if hit in the wings. Japanese crews called it hamaki, cigar, or the flying lighter. Loss rates approached 50% on many missions. This aircraft represents a design philosophy that prioritized range over survivability. It reflected Japanese strategic needs and military culture, but the human cost was staggering. Approximately 15,000 Japanese airmen died flying Betty bombers. Many of them burned alive in aircraft their own engineers knew would not protect them. Stand before this aircraft and contemplate what it means to design a machine knowing it will kill its operators. Consider the men who climbed aboard day after day, knowing they might become human torches, and flew anyway because duty demanded it. The Betty is a monument to both extraordinary engineering and extraordinary human tragedy. Frank McCoy, the Army Air Force's captain who conducted the first detailed analysis of a captured Betty, visited the museum in 1989, 3 years before his death. He stood before the aircraft for a long time, silent, remembering. A young visitor approached and asked if he'd seen combat in the Pacific. I analyzed them, the Bettys. I was one of the first Americans to really understand what the Japanese had built. What was it like finding out about the fuel tanks? McCoy was quiet for a moment. Horrifying, he finally said. Not because of what it meant for us, it made our job easier. Horrifying because of what it meant for them. Those fuel tanks were murder weapons aimed at Japanese boys, barely older than you. Engineered murder. And they knew it. The designers knew it, the commanders knew it, the crews knew it, and they all participated in the system anyway. Why? Different world, different values. They believed the mission mattered more than individual survival. They believed dying gloriously while accomplishing the mission was preferable to surviving but failing. We thought that was insane. Maybe it was, but it was their insanity, born from their circumstances, their culture, their strategic situation. Do you think they were wrong, the designers? McCoy considered the question carefully. Wrong? I don't know. Faced with impossible specifications and limited resources, they made a choice, a terrible choice, with predictable consequences. But from their perspective, within their framework, it was logical. Build protected aircraft that can't reach their targets, or build vulnerable aircraft that can. They chose to reach the targets. The tragedy isn't that they made the choice. The tragedy is that they had to make it at all. Japan fought a war they couldn't win, with resources they didn't have, using a philosophy that valued mission success over human life. The Betty was the perfect embodiment of all that, a brilliant design that achieved exactly what it was meant to achieve, at a cost so horrific we're still processing it 45 years later.
The technical intelligence reports on the Betty, classified for decades, were finally released to the public in the 1970s. They make for fascinating and disturbing reading. Engineers' notes documenting the fuel system discovery reveal their shock in real time. November 8, 1942. Opened wing access panels today. Expected to find fuel tanks installed in wing. Found wing IS tank. Entire internal volume sealed and used for fuel storage. No separate bladders, no protective systems. Estimated 630 gallons per wing. This explains combat reports of catastrophic fires. Any penetration allows fuel to spray into wing interior. Confined space ensures optimal fuel-air mixture for explosion. This is engineering malpractice on a scale I've never encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Page. November 10, 1942. Tested wing material samples. Aluminum alloy, standard gauge, no coating or protection. Puncture test with .5 caliber round showed clean penetration with significant deformation around hole. Fuel would stream through at high rate. Discussed with combat pilots today. They confirm Betty's hit and wings explode like bombs. Now understand why. These aircraft are bombs. Flying fuel containers wrapped in aluminum foil. Captain Frank McCoy. November 13, 1942. Completed weight analysis. If Betty incorporated self-sealing tanks and crew armor comparable to B-25, additional weight approximately 1,500 pounds. Would reduce range from 2,935 miles to approximately 2,200 miles. Still exceptional. Question: why didn't Japanese accept this trade-off? Answer: speculation. Range requirement was non-negotiable. Strategic planning demanded ability to reach targets 1,000 plus miles distant. Without that range, aircraft served no purpose. Better to have vulnerable long-range bomber than invulnerable short-range one. This logic is sound if you accept the premise that mission success matters more than crew survival. Americans don't accept that premise. Japanese apparently do. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Page. November 15, 1942. Interviewed Australian pilot who survived an encounter with a Betty formation. Asked about their tactics. He described bombers holding formation even after multiple aircraft burning. He said, they didn't break formation, they didn't evade, they just kept coming straight at us while their mates burned beside them. We shot down 7 in 3 minutes. The survivors pressed on to bomb their target. It was the most disciplined and the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. This confirms Japanese crews know the risks. They fly anyway. The Betty isn't just a technical artifact. It's a window into a military culture we need to understand if we're going to win this war. They will die for objectives we wouldn't consider worth the risk. That dedication is both their strength and their fatal weakness. These notes, written in real time as Americans encountered Japanese design philosophy for the first time, capture the collision of cultures. American engineers couldn't comprehend deliberately designing a death trap. Japanese engineers couldn't comprehend allowing protection to compromise capability. Both perspectives were internally consistent. Both made sense within their respective frameworks. They were simply incompatible worldviews.
By 1944, the Betty's vulnerability had become so notorious that Japanese commanders struggled to find crews willing to fly them. Not because of cowardice. Japanese military culture made refusing combat assignments virtually impossible, but because survival rates had dropped to the point where flying a Betty was effectively a death sentence. One particularly grim statistic. In the Marianas Campaign of June-July 1944, G4M units flew 147 combat sorties. Of those missions, 94 aircraft were lost, a 64% loss rate. Of the crews shot down, fewer than 30 individuals survived, either by parachute or rescue. That's a mortality rate exceeding 95% for downed aircraft. For comparison, German bomber crews on the devastating raids against Soviet targets in 1941-42 faced loss rates around 10 to 15%. American bomber crews over Germany in 1943, during the worst of the pre-escort period, faced loss rates of 20 to 25%. Both of these were considered catastrophic and unsustainable. The Betty crews in 1944 faced losses 3 times worse than the worst American bomber formations ever encountered, and they kept flying. Diary entries from Japanese Betty crews recovered from crash sites and captured bases reveal how they processed this reality. June 15, 1944. Tomorrow we attack the American invasion fleet off Saipan. Of the 12 aircraft assigned, I expect perhaps 4 will return. I do not expect to be among them. Tonight, I have written my final letters. I have given my personal effects to Tanaka, who is remaining behind with a broken arm. He promises to send them to my family if I do not return. I do not fear death. What I fear is burning. I have seen men burn. It is not a good death, but it is the death assigned to me, and I will face it properly. The Betty is my aircraft. Its weakness is my weakness. We will burn together if that is our fate. The alternative is to refuse to fly, to abandon my duty, to bring shame on my family. This is impossible. Better to burn than to live with dishonor. If I am to die tomorrow, let it be said, I did my duty. That is all that matters. The pilot who wrote this entry, Lieutenant Akira Tanakabe, died the next day. His Betty was shot down by F-6F Hellcats from USS Bunker Hill, hit in the left wing at 14:23 hours. The aircraft burned for 18 seconds before the wing separated. No parachutes were observed. He was 23 years old. Thousands of similar stories played out across the Pacific. Young men climbing into aircraft they knew would burn, flying missions they knew most wouldn't survive, doing it because their culture and military system offered no alternative they could accept. The Betty bomber became a mass execution machine, not for enemies, but for its own crews.
The engineering lessons of the Betty were not lost on post-war aircraft designers. When American engineers built the first jet bombers in the late 1940s, fuel tank protection was non-negotiable. The B-47 Stratojet, designed with lessons from World War II fresh in mind, incorporated self-sealing bladder tanks despite the weight penalty. The logic: a bomber that survives to strike again is worth more than one with slightly longer range. Soviet designers studying captured Japanese and German aircraft reached similar conclusions. The Ilyushin IL-28 jet bomber included comprehensive fuel protection, despite Soviet doctrine traditionally prioritizing performance over survivability. British designers went even further. The Canberra bomber featured fuel tanks physically separated from the fuselage structure, contained in armored bays with fire suppression systems. It was heavier than it needed to be, but Canberra crews had dramatically better survival rates when damaged. The Betty's legacy was written in the design specifications of every subsequent bomber. Fuel protection is not optional. Crew survivability is not negotiable. Performance gains achieved by eliminating protection are false economies that reduce overall effectiveness. Japanese designers learned the same lesson, though the learning came too late. The Nakajima G8N Renzan, designed in 1944 as the Betty's replacement, incorporated self-sealing tanks, crew armor, and heavy defensive armament. It also weighed 60% more than the Betty and had 30% less range. Only 4 prototypes were built before war's end. None saw combat, but they represented a tacit admission. The Betty's design philosophy had failed. Kiro Honjo, the engineer who designed the Betty, survived the war. He never designed another aircraft. In a 1962 interview, late in his life, he was asked about the Betty. "I designed what the Navy required. They needed range above all else. I gave them range. The consequences were not unexpected. We understood fuel would be vulnerable. We accepted this as necessary. If I could do it again? I don't know. The Navy's specifications were based on strategic reality. Without the range, the aircraft served no purpose. The Pacific is vast, unimaginable distances. Either we could reach American ships or we couldn't. There was no middle ground." But yes, the losses were terrible, worse than we anticipated. The integral fuel tanks proved more vulnerable than calculated. American ammunition, the incendiary rounds, they ignited fuel vapor more readily than we tested for. I am an engineer. I solved the problem presented to me. But I am also a man. I think of the crews who burned. I think of them often. In my dreams, I still see them burning. Engineering is mathematics, but the mathematics we did not calculate was human cost. We treated crew survival as a variable that could be optimized away. This was perhaps our greatest mistake. Not technically. The Betty performed as designed. Morally, ethically. I gave Japan the range it needed, but I took from thousands of young men their right to expect their aircraft would protect them. That debt cannot be calculated or repaid.
The Betty bomber's story ends where it began, with mathematics. The cold calculus of range versus protection, performance versus survival, strategic necessity versus human cost. The final equation was elegant in its simplicity. Range equals 2,935 miles. Crew protection equals 0. Result equals 15,000 dead. If the equation had been range equals 2,200 miles, crew protection equals adequate, and result equals ? We'll never know. The Japanese Navy chose the first equation, and the Betty's crews paid the price. At the Pacific Aviation Museum, Pearl Harbor, in a quiet corner of the hangar, there's a small memorial to Japanese aviators. It includes a photograph of a Betty crew, 7 young men in leather flight gear, standing before their aircraft, smiling for the camera. The photo is dated April 1943. None of them survived the war. The Betty bomber behind them, visible in the photograph's background, looks massive and capable. Its wings, which held enough fuel to fly 3,000 miles, glint in the tropical sun. Those wings, which would burn like magnesium when hit, look innocent, just graceful aluminum curves tapering to elegant tips. Nothing in the photograph suggests these 7 men are standing before their own funeral pyre. Nothing indicates this aircraft is a designed death trap. They look confident, professional, ready for combat. They were all of those things. They were also doomed by mathematics decided in a design office 5 years before this photograph was taken. The memorial's inscription reads simply, "To all aviators who served their nations in war, regardless of flag, may we honor their courage while learning from the failures that cost their lives." It doesn't mention the Betty specifically. It doesn't need to. Everyone who studies Pacific aviation knows the story. The flying cigar, the one-shot lighter, the bomber that became a crematorium at 18,000 feet. The aircraft U.S. engineers took apart and couldn't believe what they found inside. Not because it was revolutionary technology, not because it was beyond their understanding, but because it revealed a military philosophy so alien, so willing to sacrifice its own men, that American engineers initially couldn't accept they were reading the evidence correctly. There must be something we're missing, they thought. Nobody would deliberately design this. Nobody would accept sending men to burn for the sake of 600 extra miles of range. But someone had, and someone did. And 15,000 Japanese airmen paid the price for strategic calculations that valued missions over men. The Betty bomber, an engineering triumph and a human catastrophe, wrapped in aluminum and fueled by the blood of its own crews. When Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch watched that first Betty explode over the Lexington in February 1942, he couldn't have imagined he was witnessing the beginning of one of the war's most systematic and preventable slaughters. The Japanese had built a fleet of flying funeral pyres and called them bombers. American fighters didn't defeat the Betty. Physics did. Thermodynamics did. The immutable reality that 1,260 gallons of aviation gasoline exposed to oxygen and ignition sources will burn at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, consuming aluminum structure in seconds and incinerating human flesh instantly. The Japanese knew this. They built the Betty anyway. And 15,000 men climbed aboard and flew into the sky, carrying their own fuel for their own funeral pyres, because honor and duty demanded it, and their aircraft's design guaranteed it. That's not bravery. It's not cowardice either. It's something more complex and more tragic. Human beings trapped between cultural imperatives, strategic requirements, and engineering limitations that made survival almost impossible. The Betty bomber reveals the darkest truth about military technology. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is the one you build for yourself. And sometimes, the highest casualty rate comes not from enemy action, but from your own design choices. When American engineers finished examining that first captured Betty at Eagle Farm Air Base, Frank McCoy made one final note in his report. "We have found the enemy's weakness. It is not their courage, their skill, or their determination. It is their willingness to sacrifice everything, including the lives of irreplaceable trained crews, for marginal performance advantages. They have built beautiful aircraft that murder their own men. This is a war we can win because they're killing themselves faster than we ever could. But it is a victory that brings no satisfaction, because we're defeating not warriors, but victims of their own military systems' twisted priorities. The Betty is not really a weapon. It's a monument to what happens when strategic desperation meets engineering compromise and human life becomes the variable optimized away. God help the men who fly these things. Their own commanders already haven't. The thunder of American fighters faded over the Pacific as the war wound down. But the screams of men burning alive in Betty bombers, trapped in aircraft designed to incinerate them, echoed long after the last bomb fell. That's the real story of the Betty bomber. Not a tale of Japanese ingenuity or American superiority. A tragedy of mathematics prioritized over humanity, of strategic requirements overruling human survival, of brilliantly engineered death traps carrying brave men to foreseeable and preventable deaths. The Betty bomber flew 3,000 miles on a tank of gas, and every single one of those miles was paid for in blood.